Welcome, everyone, to this fun and exciting episode of This Much I Know with one of my good friends and one of the most absolutely excellent human beings on this planet, Jerry Colonna, who is not only a coach extraordinaire, but the reason why I say he's one of the most excellent people that I know is because depending on how you gauge excellence in this world, and one of the ways that I gauge it is not just the usual ways that most people tend to do it when they read magazines or watch TV, but primarily is how many people you impact in your life. And I think that Jerry, you have done that in spades. Your career early days was maybe what most people would say is what most of us are sold we should be doing,
hmm
but definitely your career since 2001 has been a lot about shaping others and shaping them and understanding themselves and understanding those around them. So, welcome to the episode.
Well, I have no idea how I'm going to follow that introduction. Extraordinaire, fun, no pressure, Carlos.
No
Thanks.
pressure.
Thank
Um,
you very much for that introduction. That was very, very kind of you.
no, look, well, let's unpack that. Let's unpack how you became you.
Sure.
So one of the things that caught me by surprise, and I think it will for many founders and others that are listening to this, is that in spite of the fact that you've had absolutely tremendous success financially, professionally, in every which way in the tech industry,
You forget that
you
I'm handsome too.
handsome, yes, fair enough,
Yes.
fair enough. We're approaching the same haircuts almost. Um, but you started off your career in English literature. Now, I find that fascinating because I think a lot of people, to me, it
Right.
speaks of how much where you start off in life does not dictate where you end up in life. And so I would love for you to unpack, those early days, like, and I'll bring up questions that have themes around the book that
Sure.
you recently wrote. And one of the themes is, what opportunities you're given and how that shapes your outcomes and being thoughtful of the opportunities others have been given and their outcomes. And maybe you can walk us through a little bit how you ended up studying what you did, and then how you ended up going from that to running a venture fund, and the transitions therein.
Sure. And I really welcome the question because it's an opportunity to sort of look backwards and see things. I hesitated when you made the comment about, about the surprising twist how I began life as an English major, English literature major in college, and then ended up being who I am. And of course, from my seat, it all makes sense. From my seat, it's a through line. And in this way, I will say that I'm still the kid who's fascinated with English literature. I'm still the kid who looks to stories to make sense of the world. I'm still the kid who loves language and is moved deeply by the ability of language to move people, both for good and for ill. And I am committed, as I was in my early 20s, to using language to ease suffering. So for me, I'm not kidding when I say the through line is really, really clear. So pause. That through line started with English literature, led to being a journalist, which led to being a technology journalist, which led to being curious about technology and what it could do for human beings, which led to a career as an investor, which then led to where I am today. So again, it's another through line.
Yeah, it's fascinating how those through lines. I think there's a book written on this called like the thin red line or the red
Mm,
string or something like that. And basically it's a mechanism of looking back in your life and seeing where these things are tied together and where they could project you into the future based upon that
that's
common
right.
thread. But when I look at the kinds of skills that you developed over that career, especially the time you spent with Fred Wilson, maybe you can unpack a little bit of the lessons you learned as an investor that shaped what your lessons are now, what your sort of learnings are now from people development, leadership development, building organizations, building tribes, building teams of teams.
Sure. I'll take a step before becoming a venture capitalist, and to put some structure to it. The venture capital firm I co-founded with Fred Wilson in 1996 was actually my second venture capital firm. The first one was a firm called CMG at Ventures, which we founded in 1994. And I had a kind of miserable time of it. Questioned whether or not I wanted to be a venture capitalist at that time. And then eventually, because of the relationship with Fred, ended up founding Flatiron Partners, which at the time was one of the most successful venture firms. Anyway, I want to take a step back and say what I learned as a technology reporter is what I applied to my career as a venture capitalist, which is what I continue to apply as in my career as an executive coach. And that is that human beings make the difference. Human beings are the story to focus on. When I was a young journalist, and it won't surprise you to hear this, I was very, very famous for interviewing CEOs and magically getting them to cry, right? And I laugh because that's still my reputation, right? And the reason is that I do the same things today that I was doing as a reporter, and frankly, that I did as an investor, which was unpack, peel away the layers, really try to get to understand what's going on and what the opportunity is. The motivations may have been different. I was looking for a story as a journalist. I was looking for a return on investment as an investor. And today I'm looking to alleviate the suffering that people carry. But in the end, I'm using the same methods, which is listening deeply, asking really curious questions, and trying to understand what's at stake, what's going on for that person. So again, another red thread, another through line, if you will.
So that's a very interesting way of putting it. The methods are the same, but the motivations are different. And
Mm,
you mentioned the three motivations that you had over your career. The first one
mhm,
being stories, right? Seeking what is
mhm.
the interesting angle, and presumably you're looking at two different points of view here. You're looking at the story that the person's sharing with you, and
Right.
for good or for bad, the story that is interesting to
Behind
the
the story.
reader,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, or the story behind the story.
Or the story behind the story. And that within of itself is driven with a certain level of motivations that can be malevolent or can be benevolent, right?
Right.
Um, then when you moved over to the motivation of return on investment, again, you can have malevolent motivations and benevolent motivations. And the the reason why I'm harping on this is because the third motivation, which alleviate suffering people carry, is pretty much like a benevolent motivation. But when I look at the
Well,
skills, I mean, you could spin it whichever way
there's
you
some
want.
ego associated with that. It makes me
Correct.
feel good to see myself as alleviating suffering, but I'll acknowledge that piece of it. But keep going. It's not
It's a
malevolent, but it's self-serving.
Yes, it could be. It could be construed as that, and that in of itself
Right.
can create dependency, and we can unpack
Correct.
that when we come to coaching. But if I rewind it back to the return on investment part, and this is for anybody who's an investor who's listening, one of the things that you could look at in terms of the motivations of a coach and or anybody who has recruited a coach or who is
Mhm.
recommending for a CEO to take on a coach is to shape the the things about the person that prevent them from succeeding. And so when I look at
Mhm.
the list of all the companies you invested in, I would be very surprised if you were able to select only the companies with founders who had very little to improve on that were not preventing them from maximizing their return on investment. In other words, I'd be very surprised if you were not motivated to sort of ascertain the issues that were preventing certain founders from achieving the maximum they could be, and trying to shape that for the purposes that you had as a venture capitalist, which was return on investment. And I want to understand how you managed and how you unpacked those questions, how you help them become better versions, and were you effectively maybe pursuing something that you were both aligned in, or just something that you were interested in?
Well, that latter little bit of your question is a very complex question, so we'll leave that to the end and speak to the first part. I remember when I first started my career as a coach, which was about 20 years ago, and it was after a several year hiatus between being an active investor and kind of wandering through the desert of midlife, and then sort of landing on a new iteration of myself, a new incarnation of myself. But I remember telling folks that what I was doing as a coach was that I had managed to create a career out of doing what I had done naturally when I was a board member. See, when we think of ourselves as investors, there's of course there's finding and securing an investment opportunity. That's thing one. But and that's where so much focus tends to be for people who are not in the investment space. But as you know very well, the majority of the energy is focused on thing two, which is actually supporting the portfolio company. And so I found myself, and I would be surprised if you didn't find yourself in a similar place, of being the person that got the phone call at 10 o'clock at night on Friday night from the CEO saying, I can't take it anymore. I'm done. And walking them back off the ledge and talking through not, yes, business model challenges, product market fit challenges, all of, LTV to CAC ratios, is it, but really, what were we talking about? The emotional burden of being a founding CEO. And I increasingly found myself being the person on the board to mediate conflict, to try to get my fellow board members to manage their anxiety so that they weren't driving the executive team crazy, and to allow the senior leaders to really grow into the best possible version of themselves. I was using the same skills that I had as a reporter, which was listening deeply, asking questions, self-soothing my own anxieties, which as an investor were there, right? I don't want to fail. But then really being the person upon whom they could rely to get through the process. Now, was there a selfish motivation behind that? Of course, because if I could get the folks that I backed to be a little calmer, a little saner, then the chance of a greater return on investment goes up. But my values were such that I always found myself more interested in making sure that the person was okay than a return on investment. And maybe that made me a bad investor. I don't know. My stats are good, but that was the kind of investor I was. And quite frankly, it's the kind of investor Fred Wilson is. It's the kind of investor Brad Feld is. And these two folks with whom I entered the business remain to this day two of my closest friends because we're all sort of values aligned in that way. So that was a long-winded answer to your question. The second question, I don't even remember now. It's too complicated for me to remember.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's unpacking that further from the point of view of um, the motivations of return on investment, right? So,
Right.
just to enumerate a few of the things that you mentioned, you highlighted that you want to be the person someone that can rely on, which
Mm-hmm.
effectively is trust. You
Mm.
allow people to become the best versions of themselves, and that was the sort of the genesis of the second part of the question, which is someone needs to decide, you in this case, as somebody who has got a shareholder
Mm-hmm.
point of view, is what is the best possible version of themselves, and
Mm-hmm.
in what priority and in what speed. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
ultimate conflict that a self-aware VC has when they are helping leadership is, you might have an opinion, and that opinion might be that this person needs to like think more commercially, or they need to think more inclusively, or they need to, and you might have all
Right.
these thoughts, and you desperate to impose them because you think the company or the founder or the leader will be better because of them, but inherently that is a conflict. And I just wanted to understand how you reconciled your ability to ask questions deeply,
Mm.
to build that rapport and trust, but then still have these conflicting ideas in your head of return on investment juxtaposed with the reality of where the founder is in their life.
I love the question because it does reveal the complexity of the situation. You know, a lot of times, and I have many friends in the venture business who ask how they might use coach-like skills in the role that they're in. And there's definitely room for that. There's definitely capacity, learning how to listen more deeply, learning how to be an ally too, without necessarily dictating and allowing your anxieties about what the performance should be. But you're right in noting that there is a structural potential for conflict that exists. And in the end, I wasn't a VC and executive coach simultaneously. And while I wasn't consciously choosing to resolve the conflict this way at the time, I can look backwards now and see with more clarity, based on your question, what I have always held to, which is that as a coach, much to my chagrin financially, I have never taken equity in lieu of payment for my services. And why? Precisely for the potential of the conflict. Because even if I could, on an individual basis, resolve the conflict myself, the appearance of a conflict might undermine the coachee's ability to trust that the advice I'm giving or the response I'm giving is in fact rooted in wanting to advocate for them and not worried about whether or not my equity was going to be worth something in the future. And what you've backed into, Carlos, is I don't want to put myself on a high horse here, but what you've backed into is a conflict I have with much of the coaching world who don't um, have a problem with the conflict that you just identified. And I don't know how they resolve it for themselves. I know that the way I resolve it for myself is to be firm. And unfortunately, had I taken equity in lieu of cash, I'd be a lot wealthier than I am. But what does it suffer a man to gain the world if he loses his soul in the process, right?
Yeah, and that's fair. And that's fair. And it's good to hear how you manage that, which, I think that's half the battle is just having a plan of attack on how to deal with things, even if the
Yeah.
reality is occasionally messy. But maybe to wrap up your time as a VC, um, I'm curious as to how you would answer this question. It's a tricky one because um, the temptation will be to ambiguate what good is.
Mm,
But if I constrained that from a venture capital point of view, the when people get asked this question on panels or whatever, they
mm,
say, "What are the attributes of the best founders you've worked with?" The temptation is to either in your head picture people that you enjoyed working with or
mm-hmm,
people who've returned you money, and both of
mm-hmm,
them may or may not be the same. And they come with different conflicts. So I'm going to leave it open ended there, but I do want you to
mm,
sort of answer that from your VC point of view, not from your coach point of view. From your VC point of view,
mm.
what were the attributes, psycho, metric or psychological or whichever way you want to answer it, of the best founders you worked with?
Well, I think that you highlight two of the main buckets that I think are really important. And if I just look at it from the vantage point of an investor, I would say the ideal would be someone that you enjoy working with who also returns capital, right? Creates a return on capital. Um, but of course, life isn't so simple, right? There are many people that I would say were toxic, hurtful to themselves and others, who generate a return on investment. And there are many people who are really wise and good practitioners, and they're creative, and they build good companies that actually fail. And that conundrum, I think the best way that that gets resolved is if you look at, and Fred is very famous for this, but if you look at some of the best investments that I have made, it was with folks who may have failed to create a return on investment the first time around, but they grew and they learned. And so to be even more specific and less ambiguous about the characteristics, here's a funny word. I think that the best CEOs are coachable. I think that the best CEOs are open to feedback. I think the best CEOs get measured by the number of great leaders they help inculcate within their organization. And if you can get that coupled with a great idea and great execution capability and a little bit of luck, you end up generating return on investment.
Yeah, no, that resonates with me. That and yeah,
Well, you're
it's
an investor. Did you ever back somebody who failed before only to turn around and get a return?
several times actually.
So, right. But
Um,
intellectually, it doesn't make any sense, right?
yeah,
You lost
I mean,
money the
there's
first time.
to answer that question more comprehensively. There are people who we passed on investing in because of the experience not matching up with
Right.
that. So yeah, you're right. I mean, you've identified the key things, but it's also great just to hear your view on it. For all I know, you
Yeah.
could have said something completely unexpected, right? Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
if I look at that career and it's amazing career, you put it to rest in 2001. At least that's
Hmm.
what
Or
Wikipedia says.
2002.
Yeah, 2002. And again, referencing Wikipedia, which we know is the source of all truth. 2007, you launched Reboot. So there's a 6-year hiatus. That
2014.
14. Wow. Okay, so longer then. So they're
Wikipedia is really bad.
really bad. And so I just want to unpack, like, Obi-Wan Kenobi spent time in Tatooine doing I don't know what for a while before he met Luke. So what did you do? What was life like post BC pre-coach?
Yeah. Well, to really understand that time period, you have to more fully understand why I walked away from being a venture investor. And I walked away because I was 38 and my heart was broken. I was suicidally depressed. The depression that had so marked my life since childhood came back with a vengeance. I had had a suicide attempt at 18 years old, so this was a genuine threat. And I had entered therapy for the third or fourth time in my life at 30 years old. And by 38, what I often visualize is that the house of cards that I had constructed, a very performative, outward facing house of cards, really began collapsing. It was concomitant with massive changes going on in the venture business, coupled in part by or catalyzed in part by the collapse of the first internet bubble in 2001. Um, I, Fred and I had decided to wind down Flatiron Partners in 2001. He began the process that eventually launched Union Square Ventures. I joined JP Morgan as an investor, which was our primary LP, and I was miserable. But the misery wasn't linked solely to the job that I was doing. There were a lot of components to it. And the best way I can describe that, the beginning of that period, was the recognition that the inside of me did not match the outside of me. That even though, and you know, the mind fuck, excuse my language, that happened to me was that the more success I had, the worse I felt. And those who might be close to midlife will understand that phenomena. Because the closer, the more success I had, the more I had external affirmation that I felt like a dancing monkey, an organ grinder's monkey. I was not living the life that was mine to live. So, in the period between stepping down from JP Morgan, which was the end of 2002, and 2006, when I began training to be a coach, in that period, I wandered. I was all over the place. I went to Greenland and crossed the polar ice cap. I went to Chile and was rafting. I began training and studying Buddhism. I did various forms of therapy, including the psychoanalysis that I was in. But basically, what I was trying to find and be back in touch with was, who the fuck am I? Independent of the external approbation that I was living. So I was kind of in a hermitage, if you will. I was kind of in this years-long retreat, trying to figure out who I was. And I ended that period not with like a light switch, but slowly, slowly. This coaching thing seems interesting. What's happening here? Let me read this book. Let me read that book. And then eventually, probably another 4 or 5 years later, I emerged as the coach that I am, as honestly the man that I am today.
Yeah, it's thanks for sharing that. And it's always hard to share moments of low in life, but it's also helpful to anybody who's listening to see how
Right.
much change you can generate
Mm-hmm.
through going inwards and then going outwards. And ironically, I want to touch on this point and of your life again later, because it sounds like a lot of the foundation for the book Reunion, which we'll get to shortly. Um, but if we sort of fast forward to the start of Reboot, and I can't remember if the start of Reboot coincided with the book launch of Reboot, or if the two what the time delay was between the two things. But that you effectively synthesized a lot of those ideas that you explored into something that would then become your coaching practice. And I just want to maybe help you share with anybody who's listening to understand what it is that your coaching practice represents and how it differs from, let's say, other coaching practices. Because I think sometimes people hear of coaches and there's so many
Mm-hmm.
types that it's confusing. Like, what am I
Mm-hmm.
getting? What should I be looking for? What makes
Mm-hmm.
Jerry's version of coaching any better than, I don't know, a local coach? Or and it's a word that's thrown around a lot and for just about everything. So it'd be helpful to understand the DNA of Reboot, how
Mm-hmm.
that got synthesized, what the key elements are, and how a founder or somebody else who maybe can't engage with you because of your fees and or the time, uh, they know what to look for.
So just to put the context of timing, I was a solo entrepreneur coach for several years before co-founding Reboot, the company, in 2014. Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, my book, came out in 2019. And you're right in the sense that the book synthesized retrospectively the things that I had come to learn about myself, but more connectedly to what your question is, the things I come to believe about coaching. I think in the introduction of that book, I asked a question of myself. What do I believe about leadership? I literally wrote that in the book. And the answer that came up was that better humans make better leaders. And better humans make better leaders, as I often joke, is so freaking obvious. Except there's this funny phenomena, which is, then why do we have such shitty leadership? If it's so obvious, it should be simple. But in fact, the process of becoming a better human, and what does better mean is a complex question, but a process of being a better human, or to use language from my book, a fully grown adult, is actually really, really hard. And so one of the things I did with the book, the first book, was try to synthesize not only what my coaching is like, but what I believe to be really most helpful about coaching generally. And it is at the core of what we offer as a company. The 15 coaches within Reboot all believe in what I termed radical self-inquiry. So these are, I'm starting to give you the language that we use. What do I mean by radical self-inquiry? What did I mean? I coined that term to try to define what it was that I was doing, that I had stumbled my way into, which was this bizarre combination of kind of Buddhist insight meditation, coupled with a kind of psychoanalytic look into one's lives, together with trying to understand what prevents those who hold power, aka leaders, from leading in a way that fosters the development of those around them. What causes toxicity in leadership? Because in the pursuit to make things less painful for people, or in the pursuit of trying to go back in time and prevent me from feeling the depression that I felt in my 30s, which is kind of what I do, by focusing on other people, what I hit upon was this notion that understanding why we do what we do is a cheat code for being a better leader. So what I'm trying to do is just pull it all together in that way. The kind of coaching that we do is designed to put you, and not your unconscious, in the driver's seat. So if you choose to work 90 hours a week, do it because you're consciously choosing to do that, not because you're terrified that you will disappoint your father by being a failure. Because if you're doing it for the latter reason, you're more likely than not going to drive the people with whom you work crazy. And despite what the world says about hardcore work and this, there's no correlation with working yourself to death and success, financial success.
So it's a very good foundation for both Reboot and Reunion. This idea of understanding yourself, and I want to come back to that when we go into Reunion a little bit deeper. But staying on the topic of the relationship between a coachee and a coacher, or coach and a coachee, whichever the terms are, I'm conscious that the abstract objective is still very much hard to discern when you're engaging a new coach. So I can understand the methodology as the way you just described it. I can understand the outcome as you described it, but discerning a good coach from a bad coach, first problem. The next problem is, how long should I invest in coaching before I develop an insight of some sort? In your book, you talk about how You had somebody who would just come and talk about work problems for a long time until eventually something clicked, right? So time to insight, right? So how do I find a coach? What's my expectations for time to insight? Then time to change. In other words, like what should people be expecting before they see the results of taking on a coach? And I'm sorry, I'm asking these very pragmatic, very sort of
No, I
return on
like them.
investment questions. And partially it's because some people may be on the fence because they don't know what to expect. Am I just signing up for like in effect a sort of a non conclusive, non insightful from a time perspective, actionable things? Is it entirely just introspection with no action? And I want to park any of those concerns people have as part of what you address now is what can people expect by when and how, and
Mm-hmm.
how do they know they have the right coach? Because coaches are not something as regulated as maybe a
Yeah, it's the wild, wild
gastroenterologist.
west.
Yes.
Right. You're right. Definitely not as regulated as it is gastroenterologist. Okay, there are a lot of questions in there. I'm going to attempt
Yes.
to get to some of them. Okay. Um, you asked one question, how do I find a coach? I'm actually going to answer that question slightly differently. How do I pick a coach? Because to find a coach, all you have to do is do a Google search. It's not that hard to find someone. And yes, you want to do referrals and you want to talk to people who have worked with somebody before. So it's not unlike other helping professions, right? Do you open up the equivalent of a Yellow Pages directory? I know the youngsters in the audience won't know what I'm talking about. To find a doctor? Of course not, right? You have to search. Some of the things to try to understand are what is their experience? So I believe that good coaching goes beyond just the coach training program that the coach went through, but brings a good coach will bring a variety of life experiences into the dialogue. And so um, coaches, clients who work with me oftentimes feel very fortunate that I have served on 150 boards of directors across my life, or that I've participated in thousands of fundraising conversations, or that I have built companies before. Now, that's not absolutely essential to get value out of a coaching relationship, but it is something to consider what's going on. I would say steer clear of the 22-year-old life coach who's going to attempt to help you sort of figure it, because they may be really sweet and kind and wonderful, but they're a little bit unleavened loaves of bread. They need a little rising before, they can be in that position. You know, a corollary question would be to ask to what degree does the coach end up doing their own work? Does the coach have a therapist or coach? And this is absolutely essential, Carlos, because the coach-client relationship is fraught with something that most coaches don't talk about, which is a psychological concept called transference. What you're going through impacts what I'm going through, and vice versa. And if I don't have a good place to put those feelings, unconsciously and passive aggressively, I might start to warp and twist the client experience. And one way to figure out this is if the coach is very concerned about making sure to get your logo on their website. Right? Just as soon as I say that, I hope the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Because just like we were talking about before, about the coach being concerned about getting equity and thus undermining the trust, the coach being concerned about you making them look good, that's a real problem. And you're right, it's unregulated and there's nothing stopping that shit. from happening. And you can tell if I'm angry, it's because there's too much of that going on. The last thing to be clear about is what are your objectives? What are your goals? There are coaches who will help you with public speaking, and there are coaches who will help you with sales training. To my mind, they're not the kind of coach I'm talking about. And maybe arguably I'm on this, on a spectrum between coaching and therapy. I'm probably closer to therapy, or what's called positive psychology or human-centered therapy, that kind of thing. Because, Carlos, what I'm interested in and what good coaching should be interested in is you no longer needing the coach. There is a day, and it varies from client to client, but there is a day when the client looks at the coach and says, I love you, I really appreciate what you've done, but I'm actually good. And that day should be celebrated. And there are too many coaches out there who are too scared of losing the client to let that happen. So I just gave you a bunch of warning signs here. I hope they're pragmatic in that way.
They are, and I think you cover indirectly and directly some of the things that you offer, but also how you differ from other coaches. And when people are looking for a very specific kind of coach,
Right.
in the way that you serve, you can help them. There's one little nuance that I just wanted to unpack a little bit
Mm,
further. Um, as I listen to you, and I try to listen from the point of view of somebody who's not as well versed in some of these things, and I
mm,
think just from a starting point of zero,
mm,
I think, is it overpromising that by engaging with a coach like you or others like you, um, I might be able to resolve issues like presentation coaching? In other words, the very inhibitor of confidence or whatever it is that's preventing me from being a good presentation giver or whatever
mm,
is not coming from the skills required to be a good presenter, but rather from something deeper, some insecurity or others. And I'm trying to help the listener calibrate, do you have a collection of coaches? Do you pick
mm.
a one type of coach, and that person unlocks potential across many others? Do you start with one first? It's just a endless sea of possibilities, and it's just useful for how you would advise someone exploring this idea.
Yeah, so a couple of things to build upon it. I and my colleagues at Reboot come from a land of what we would call transformation coaching. And so the agenda that the client holds, and that's a really important phrase I just used, because the client should be driving the agenda, not the coach. The agenda should be something needs to change in order for me to create the kind of life that I want to have, to be the leader that I would like to be. If transformation isn't the motivation, Reboot's not the coaching company. Okay? And this is something to have in conversation with the coaches, with the potential coaches that you might talk to. Tell me about what your philosophy is. Tell me what your goal is. How do you measure success? Now, you implicitly noted something. Can any coach guarantee transformation? And the answer, of course, is no. Okay? Um, People will often ask me, at this point, I am blessed that I have a waiting list and people want to get in, and I almost can never take on a new client. But people will say to me, well, what is it that interests you in a client? And it's really not their status, how big their company is, what a big person they are in the world. It's one thing and one thing only. How willing are they to do the work? Because a coach who presents himself as what I would say is a snowplow, standing in front of you, clearing the path, making it easy for you, that's not coaching. Or the coach who stands behind you and says, I'm going to be your hard ass and I'm going to push you, that's not coaching. Okay? And many people want somebody to stand behind. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who says, I want a hard ass. Great. Go to the gym. Have the personal trainer yell at you that you're not lifting weights enough, okay? That's not coaching. The coach stands shoulder to shoulder with you and helps you see, here's my infamous phrase, the ways you have been complicit in holding yourself back, the ways you have been complicit in creating the conditions you say you don't want. If you think you're going to outsource that work to a coach, you are going to be dissatisfied. When you sign up to do work with a coach, you are signing up to do the work of your life. And sometimes that will take a month. Sometimes it will take 6 months. Sometimes I have clients, either I'm a shitty coach or they're a shitty client. I have clients that go back 10, 12, 15 years. Okay? Now, what I take from my long tenure with clients, because they have a month-to-month contract and they can cancel anytime. What I take is every month they reaffirm that the conversations are valuable. If they felt, I just graduated a client after 2 years. In his note to me afterwards, he said, you helped me through two of the most important challenges of my career. Thank you. Okay, we're done. That's it. And the door is always open if he wants to come back because he's got another challenge. You see what I mean about like shoulder to shoulder versus in front or
Yeah.
behind?
And that's good. It's good for, anybody who's thinking through what the expectation should be. And that brings me to the book. I know that it's a long lead up to the book reunion, and I'm going to attempt something which might you might humble me on, is to try to summarize the book very succinctly for the readers, both in order to instill perhaps an interest in reading it, but also in sort of expediting the conversation. Um, First of all, I just want to comment that the book represents a lot of pain. I read it. There's a lot of stories of pain in the book, and I think that the stories there are there to design in the listener how what you call othering people, which is where you don't look at them as part and parcel of you and your life, and you distance their problems from yours. That this lack of understanding, and this lack of empathy towards others and othering them inhibits your ability to not only um, create organizations whereby you co-lead with them because you understand them and they understand you, but also, in your words, your story is my story. Um, but the book is also about understanding your stories, and we touched upon this a little bit earlier. Is understanding how you bring into organizations and leadership your own issues, and you share a lot of your own personal stories. The loss of one of your best friends, Marcus, and it's a tricky read. It's a tricky read. It's a hard read from the emotional point of view, not from like obviously
Yeah.
very beautifully written, but it's more from like an emotionally challenging book because it makes you realize how much leadership challenges, organizational challenges are holding onto that othering that people in your organization have felt leading up to that point. How you might have to create a structure that allows them not to feel that, addressing your own issues, and then building something collaborative amongst all that suffering and pain that is constructive and productive for everyone involved. So I don't know if you want to comment on that summary. I don't know if it's a good one or bad one, but maybe you can just walk us through the motivations of the book and the goals for the reader.
The summary was beautiful. And I've done dozens and dozens of podcast interviews on this book. And you're the first person to mention Marcus, who was my closest friend, and who, because of the nefarious forces at work in the American society that would pit one group against another, in this case, blacks against whites in the 1960s, I lost my best friend. He's alive somewhere, I think, but we suddenly moved away from each other. I moved away from him. And it's one of the most painful memories. So I thank you for mentioning Marcus. Thank you for summarizing the book. Let me build slightly on what you said, because you did summarize it. In Reboot, I sought to unpack this question of what does it mean to be a better leader? What does it mean to be a better human? In 2020, because of her response to the murder of George Floyd, my daughter took to the streets to protest what was happening in the world. That caused this really profound re-examination of my own motivations. Okay, wise guy, you're out there in the world talking about better humans, but, and you're talking about how have I been complicit in creating the conditions you say you don't want, my infamous question. But there's a world of suffering going on out there. Carlos, we live in a world right now where babies get murdered for ideology. Now, this isn't new, but it has increased. Okay? And the question that I sought, the first question I asked in Reboot was, what does it mean to be a leader? In this question, in this book, I asked, what does it mean to be a leader in a world where babies get murdered? And what is our moral and ethical responsibility as leaders, as business people, when that happens? And so I ended up, if the first book was retrospective, the second book, Reunion, documents a process that I went through, which is part of the pain that you see, because it was a painful inner journey. How have I been complicit in and benefited from conditions in the world that I say I don't want to see? I don't want to see war. I don't want to see fights over immigration. I don't want to see people fear for their lives because of the color of their skin or because of their racial, religious, gender identities. I don't want to see that world. I think that these are essential questions to ask oneself in this practice and process of growing up. I'm not suggesting that every single startup CEO or every single entrepreneur needs to go on that reunion journey. What I am suggesting is that learning to reunite with who your ancestors were, what parts of you have you disowned, is an intriguing and interesting groundwork for participating in a world that's a little bit more kind and a little bit more empathetic. Or as I say in the last chapter of the book, in a world, quoting Bell Hooks' poem, When Angels Speak of Love, where angels speak of love. So, yeah, I think you did a good job summarizing the book.
I mean, it's very touching. Thank you for sharing the motivations behind it and for writing it. It definitely makes you, as the reader, think about um, how you impact that. I'm going to ask you a tricky question on this because it's not intrinsically in the nature of the book to address this, but it is something that, as an engineer, I couldn't help but ask myself.
Sure.
So, in the book *Sapiens*, for those that haven't read it, it's a really good book on sort of a very succinct summary of the human civilization as it's progressed. and with, bias here and there. There's some comments you can have, but one of the interesting things about it is that the author does a really good job of stitching together how societies have been shaped by our inventions. And
Right.
those inventions include everything from like accounting as an invention or credit as an invention. And these are structures. I'm just going to call them structures or processes, because I want to avoid ideologies. I want to just
Right.
focus
Great.
it on functional structures and processes. And these functional structures and processes, sadly, almost always have flaws which other people, right? Think about credit systems.
Hmm.
For the credit
Hmm.
system to
Yeah.
function, it needs to have a credit rating. For
Right.
for a credit rating to function, you need to have people have high credit and low credit, and then you need to have a starting point and an end point in that credit cycle. And as with every human system, you end up having all the elements that create the chaos, which create the othering, which then substantiate and they perpetuate that issue. So you were a VC, and as a VC, you saw the worst and the best of how othering can happen, and
Mm.
everything from how people are hired to how somebody deals with their colleagues and in every which way, right? And I'm wondering, I mean, this is a moment for like absolute nuts creativity. If the world were your
Mm.
oyster and you could rewrite asset class of venture capital, how do you see venture capital as an asset class evolving to solve the reunion problem?
I don't know. I don't know. When I set about writing the book, I was very, very clear with my editor, who said, wait, you're a rich, old, white, straight dude talking about systemic othering. You sure you want to go there? And I said, if rich, white, straight, cisgender, white dudes like me don't talk about these things, I'm not sure how things will change. Okay. What I did not attempt to do, what I do not assert, is that I have the answers. What I do have are a lot of questions. And I think your question is a great question. What, if anything, can the allocation of capital do to address society challenges? What a fucking profound question. Now, you describe venture as an asset class specifically, but I would argue how we choose to allocate capital, if we pretend that that is just an objective, merit-based, non-biased choice, then not only are we doing a disservice to those who are challenged, we're actually not being inventive enough to think about the ways allocation of capital could make the world a little bit better. A perfect example of this, which is perhaps a little bit less charged, is climate, right? It's perfectly logical right now and acceptable for someone to launch a venture firm that is focused on capitalizing climate change alleviating technologies, right? It's a huge area right now. So what we're using are our choices about the allocation of resources and policy and capital to see if we can make the world a better place. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know. But when I look at my descendants' eyes, when I look at my children or someday my grandchildren, do I want to look at them and say, it was too hard, so we chose not to do anything? Or do I want to look and say, we chose, we failed, but we tried? For me personally, it's the latter. That's the way I want to live my life.
And for me, the takeaway from we tried, for me, the takeaway is that because there is no clarity on the structure, and nobody has an agreement on what, the next version of accounting. I'm just using the metaphor of
Yep,
like,
yep,
the
yep.
system.
I love it.
Because we don't have clarity on it. It sounds to me like the challenge of the leader is to contain the collective anxieties and indecisions of those that are in the conversation and drive for an outcome in spite of how uncomfortable it is. And that sounds to me like it's the challenge that your book leaves the author with, is not just leading through understanding how others have been othered, but understanding that you now need to navigate a series of very complicated issues,
Mm,
standing up for what is right, not
mm,
being neutral in supporting the oppressor, which is, your words in the book.
mm.
Um, but in
Well, Elie Wiesel, but yes.
engaging in very difficult conversations with no clarity specifically, but
Mm,
knowing that the beautiful outcome comes from those conversations is
mhm.
is part of the challenge.
I think you summarize it quite well. I've got the book in my hand right now because I wanted to read a quote. Um, it is to contain those anxieties and uncertainties, but more important, to ask the questions that would provoke participation in the work, broadly speaking, the work with a capital W. And what do I mean by that? If you want to take away anything from my book, take away this quote from the Talmud, from Rabbi Tarfon. And I use this as an epigram. He says, "It is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it." That is a very, very profound and audacious um, teaching. Because what it calls us to is, you have to try even though you're likely to fail. And that is not something entrepreneurs and business people are used to. That is not something that we are acculturated in doing. See, progress doesn't happen unless we try in the face of failure. Or, as the rabbi teaches, in the notion that the success may not happen in our lifetimes. But you don't get a free pass because the work is hard, or because you might fail, or because it might not make a difference. You just don't get a free pass. And I'll take us back to what's at stake. Babies are being shot because of ideology. And I've heard people say to me, well, babies have always been shot or killed. That is true. See, in a sense, reunion, as hard as it is, it's hopeful. It believes in the possible. I believe in what's possible, even though all of the evidence contradicts that. I don't want to live my life hopeless. And I hope you don't live your life hopelessly. There's a power in hoping.
With that, Jerry, and that inspiring concluding thought, just wanted to thank you for your time. For those that are listening, the book is widely available, and you can visit reboot.io is the website for the program that Jerry's involved with. And if you believe coaching is right for you, feel free to reach out to his team. Thank you so much, Jerry. It's been an amazing conversation. I always get a lot of insights.
Mm.
And yeah, look forward to chatting next time.
Well, Carlos, thank you. Thank you for such a close read. Thank you for being so open. Thank you for some really challenging questions. I really appreciate them. To me, our goal is to induce more conversation, not more conclusions, if you will. So thank you for hosting this conversation.
Thank you. Until next time, guys, see you later.